Hello and welcome to Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. I'm your host, Paul George. This month marks the 150th anniversary of the birth of Mohandas Gandhi, a revered civil and human rights activist known for his development of the use of nonviolence in those struggles. His principles inspired and informed the struggles of our own revered civil and human rights leader, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. To commemorate this occasion, Stanford University's Martin Luther King Jr. Institute will be hosting the Gandhi-King Global Initiative, a three-day gathering to launch an international network of institutions, organizations, and activists committed to the nonviolent struggle for human rights. On this month's Other Voices, we'll learn about the histories of these two remarkable leaders, how they are connected, the meaning of nonviolence, and of course, we'll get details on the conference, which takes place October 11th through the 13th at Stanford University. And joining me to help with this discussion, I'm really pleased to welcome back to Other Voices Dr. Clayborne Carson, the Executive Director of the King Institute and a Professor of History at Stanford University. Selected in 1985 by Mrs. Coretta Scott King to edit and publish the papers of her late husband, Dr. Carson has devoted most of his professional life to the study of Martin Luther King Jr. and the movements King inspired. Under Carson's direction, the King Papers Project has produced 7 volumes of Dr. King's speeches, sermons, correspondence, publications, and unpublished writings. In 2005, the King Papers Project became part of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute at Stanford University, with Dr. Carson serving as its founding director. Welcome back to Other Voices.
Good to be here.
Great to have you here. And before I get into what sounds like a really exciting conference, I mean, just looking at the list of speakers and your plans, I'd like to get into some history for folks, because I think it's good, and especially on the 150th anniversary, to remind ourselves of why and how these two leaders had such a great impact. And so let's start with Mohandas Gandhi and how he came to develop this system of nonviolent protest in the face first of apartheid South Africa and then at home in occupied India, where he was born and raised. How did he come upon it?
Well, it's a fascinating story, and it really starts 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, when he was thrown off a train for riding in the first-class compartment, and he
was in South Africa.
In South Africa, and he decided to respond to this by trying to organize. Initially, fairly conservative in his outlook, in the sense that he was asserting his right as a British subject. You know, he felt that he should not be treated this way, and that so he thought in terms of the law. He had gone to England to be trained as a lawyer.
He was serving there as a lawyer.
And but then he took on the task of trying to represent the interests of the Indian community in South Africa, which was rather large, as in many places. I mean, one of the ironies of history is that as slavery was overcome, the need for labor throughout the world led to the use of Indian labor, enormous supply of labor, sometimes indentured, sometimes not, but throughout the Caribbean, throughout many parts of the world, Indian labor replaced slave labor as one of the primary, more flexible sources of labor that could go where the need was in terms of this expanding world economy.
And work cheaply.
And work cheaply,
yeah.
Yes.
And just a reminder, in apartheid South Africa, then and up until apartheid was overcome, it wasn't just black Africans that were discriminated against, but all people of color.
Yes, although different levels.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things about Gandhi initially is that even in jail, he kind of thought that he should be treated differently from black South Africans, because they were at a lower level of development, and So there, when you look at Gandhi, you see someone who develops over time.
Over time, yeah.
And moves beyond his more provincial attitudes and gradually becomes the Gandhi that we know something about.
Now, his protests in South Africa, what form did they take? Did he develop his system of nonviolent protests there?
He really developed the idea there. And some of it had to do with simply refusing to accept the rules. And I mean, one of the basic notions of Gandhi is that oppression exists when we allow it to oppress us.
Uh-huh.
If you are willing to do almost anything to avoid repression, that's resistance. And what you have to do is think of what is the most effective way. And doing it nonviolently is probably the most effective, because obviously if you had the power to overcome your oppressor, you wouldn't be oppressed.
That's right.
So it's a recognition that the only power you have is the power to say no. And if you do that with enough firmness and hopefully with enough numbers, you can gradually overcome your oppressor. Oppression depends on acquiescence.
And how would you characterize his success or lack of it in South Africa?
Moderately successful, but enough success to get attention in India.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, he writes his first book, and
While he was still in South Africa.
so by the time he's what is 50 years old? I mean, when most people are thinking of what to do with the rest of your life, he really starts the rest of his life.
Yeah.
And
that's when he returned to India?
That's when he returns to India in, I think, 1919, around there. And by that time, he is well known in India. And of course, the Indian independence movement has its own history, which starts back in the 19th century. And
I think a lot of people aren't clear that he didn't start that movement.
Oh, no, not at all.
He went home.
There was a movement already, a thriving movement, that was welcoming a leader who had already achieved some success. And so when he came in, he already had a reputation. He came into a situation where there was already a great deal of resistance, and it needed a leader who would give some guidance to it.
And what were some of his first actions when he returned to India?
Well, it took him a while to really get going. His life is kind of remarkable. Even by age 60, there wasn't too much to show, because he had not really succeeded in really bringing about any significant changes.
Hadn't attracted large numbers.
A lot of the campaigns he led had only modest success. There was the massacre, which those of you who have seen the film know about, where Indian protesters are massacred by the British Army. Mm-hmm. And it sets back the movement. Obviously, it was and this is in the 1930s. So even at that stage, there was some sense that, well, this is going to be a long struggle.
Right. They're up against very powerful occupying forces.
I mean, it's interesting to kind of compare him with King, whose active career is amazingly short.
Yes, and started much younger.
About a dozen years.
Yeah.
And a lot happens. And again, kind of like the case with Gandhi, we can't understand King except by saying he didn't start this. He came in to a movement that was already well developed. Rosa Parks was already an experienced civil rights leader before she met Martin Luther King. So it's fortunate for him, because he only lived a short life, 39 years. You know, if we compare where Gandhi was at 39 years old, we wouldn't be talking about him today.
Yeah.
But
That's
King
true.
came into a movement that was already matured. The NAACP had been around
For a long time
for a long
already.
time,
Yeah.
almost 50 years, and so he had that institutional framework to build upon.
And well, let's turn our attention to Dr. King then. How did he end up getting so taken by Gandhi's concepts of nonviolent struggle?
Well, one of the things we'll have at the conference is a display, which I call African American Gandhians.
Uh-huh.
And you know, you look at that history, and almost from the beginning of Gandhi's return to India, black newspapers in the United States pick it up and begin to publish articles about what Gandhi is doing in India. Du Bois in the Crisis writes articles about Gandhi. Howard Thurman. I hope some of you know Howard Thurman, who was a San Francisco minister for many years. His church is still in San Francisco.
Which church?
Church of All Faiths. I think that's still the name of it. And it was one of the very first, in the 1940s, one of the very first churches that was interracial. I mean, you think of that there had never really been any kind of well-established church that was truly interracial. So, but before that, in 1936, Thurman goes to India with Sue Bailey Thurman. And I never knew Howard Thurman, but Sue Bailey Thurman once came to the King Papers Project at Stanford, and I got a chance to meet her. And I met other members of his family. But he was this phenomenal theologian, minister. He wrote a book, a very influential book on black theology, pedagogy of the oppressed. Just a book that I would recommend you read now, because it really does place Christianity in a different framework. And that book influenced lots of other people when he came back. And he was only one of many, you know, these African American Gandhians who went to India. Benjamin Mays, who becomes King's mentor at Morehouse College. James Farmer, one of the founders of the Congress of Racial Equality. James Lawson, who will be at the conference next weekend, went to India in the early 1950s. And you know, Gandhi had already been assassinated, but he was able to study with Gandhians and came back with all this enthusiasm and went to Martin Luther King. And Martin Luther King said, look, you've got to come to the South. You've got to, you know, really, there's a movement going here. And he was a minister who, he had been a missionary actually in India, but he comes back and goes to Vanderbilt and becomes a divinity student and starts a workshop in Nashville. And out of that workshop come many of the leaders of the black struggle of the 60s. Diane Nash, John Lewis, who is now Congressman John Lewis, Bernard Lafayette, who will be at the conference next week. Many of these people come out of that workshop, and James Bevel, you know, another person who comes out of that, and become very influential people in the subsequent student movement of the 1960s. The people who formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. The people who lead the sit-ins in 1960, the Freedom Rise in 1961, who go into the South, you know, and the Freedom Rides go into Jackson, Mississippi, and many of those students decide to drop out of school and become full-time civil rights workers. So all of this is kind of a stream that comes from taking Gandhian ideas and adapting them to the, the background in the United States. I mean, when you think about a tactic like the sit-in, it's of course influenced by Gandhian ideas and nonviolence and all of that, but it's also influenced by the sit-down strikes of the auto unions in the 1930s, and other people who kind of figure out, like those workers who said, we have strength just by occupying our space. And that meant occupying a factory. Other workers can't come and be strike breakers if you're sitting where you are.
Right.
So that principle of the sit down, in fact, if you go back to the early articles in 1960 on the sit-ins, they're called sit-down strikes. And the sit-in name really comes gradually as the newspapers kind of start following this movement that attracts thousands of students and really is the stimulus of the movement of the 1960s, because for the first time you have a movement that spreads throughout the South, at least not into Mississippi and Alabama very much, but certainly in the upper South. It spreads throughout that region, and for the first time students are taking the initiative, young people. In the Montgomery bus boycott, it was older adults who were the leading forces. But in 1960, then you have young people. And what's important to know is that Gandhi's influence comes through King, but perhaps even more strongly comes through James Lawson, because he writes the statement of purpose of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so when they come together, they actually respect James Lawson more than Martin Luther King, because he kind of represents their framework of direct action, which they call it. So you have this other force, which I think when we think about where some of us were, that's how I grew up. They were the people who influenced me. And
SNCC.
Yeah. My first acquaintance in the movement was Stokely Carmichael, who was at that time a student at Howard University. And I met him at a student conference in the summer of 1963, right before the March on Washington. And I remember that because I was thinking, I had grown up in New Mexico, in Los Alamos of all places, and so I was thinking the most radical thing I'd ever done in my life was to go to the March on Washington. And he was saying, why would you want to just go to there? Why don't you join us in Albany, Georgia? And why don't you come to Cambridge, Maryland? And I found it hard to tell him that going to the march was about as radical as I could get at that point. But it did impress me that there were these people like Stokely. A few months later, I met Bob Moses, and that these were people closer to my own age than Martin Luther King. He wasn't that old; he was only in his early 30s.
But back then, over 30
but,
was...
Yes, right, yeah. There was that big...
Yeah,
and
I was part of that generation.
And certainly there was that brashness about the young people that appealed to me, my sense of adventure and that sense that we could... I think from a certain point on, I saw King trying to catch up with us rather than, that we were the vanguard. He was trying to catch us, not the other way around.
Yeah. Good things to remember now with the climate change movement being led by young people again.
I see that brashness coming back. And, there's no such, I hear a lot about passing the baton to no one passed the top. We grabbed the baton.
We grabbed it, right.
And it wasn't a voluntary act of giving up the
You made your own baton and
right.
marched on, yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I think that's the way it should be. I mean, I don't think Greta is waiting for adults to tell her what to do.
Clearly she is not.
Yeah.
Clearly she is not. So King came into the movement that had already embraced Gandhi's principles of nonviolence.
Yeah, and obviously when we're talking about Gandhian principles or Kingian principles, yeah, it's a complex matter. They're adapting. And at a certain point, they become SNCC's principles. They become, they're not really set in stone. I mean, what is a Gandhian principle? What is direct action? It could mean different things to different generations.
Yeah, it's not like he wrote a guidebook or anything.
I think what it really means is just a refusal to use violence, but on the other hand, to use aggressive means to achieve your end. I think most people who I knew described themselves as militants.
Mm-hmm.
Not in the sense that they would go out and get a gun. That came later. But at that time, just, I went to LA and I worked in a group called the Nonviolent Action Committee. And our sense was to be as obnoxious and aggressive as you could be. And it wasn't to be polite. It
Mm-hmm.
wasn't to our goal was different than in the South. It was much more about jobs, lesser degree housing, but mostly jobs. And our approach was, if you're not hiring black people at your supermarket, we'll shut it down on a Friday night.
Right.
And, it got the message across and got people some jobs, and it worked. And
then on to the supermarket, the other end of town.
And quite frankly, I don't know anyone who ever took a nonviolence workshop.
Uh-huh.
It was just pretty brash and the kind of thing that appeals to someone in their teens or early 20s, especially when you don't have too many responsibilities and you don't worry about going to jail. And that was the kind of movement. I think that's one of the distinctions with Martin Luther King, is that he was very cautious about going to jail, actually. Mm. And when you look at his career, he was in a different situation. He had much more to lose. He had a family. When he was arrested in Georgia in 1960, the student movement in Atlanta, they wanted to do a sit-in at one of the local department stores, and they wanted King to join them. And he was very reluctant. He didn't want to, because he knew what was going to happen, that they were going to all get arrested. But they said, "Oh, we just want you to come and watch." So they go to this downtown department store and stage a sit-in. And of course, King gets arrested. And they all go to jail. And all of them are, bailed out, except for King, because he has a probation from a previous arrest. So he gets sent to Reedsville Prison. And he's not only that, but he's taken out of his cell in the middle of the night, put into a car guarded by a police dog, and taken, not told where he's being taken. As far as he knows, he's been taken off to be dumped in a river someplace. And he's taken to Reedsville Prison, and because he had violated his probation. So one of the things he gets from that is that, these kids, they don't have any responsibilities. They're probably going to get bailed out before too long, and they'll be back in their classes. Mm-hmm. I'm Martin Luther King. Something more dire is going to happen to me. And so he's always understandably, very cautious about trying to choose when to be arrested and when not to be arrested, and when to come out and not to come out. And those kinds of things. For us, I mean, all of us are quite frightened when we go to jail. I was one of these brash teenagers the first time I went to jail, and I realized I was going to stay in a cell with these criminals. And I was an innocent kid, and I literally did not want to go to sleep in a cell with them. And I felt very sheepish, because I called my girlfriend, and later became my wife, and said, "Would you try to bail me out?" And she went around, tried to get some money together, but in the end, I fell asleep in the cell, and I woke up in the morning, and I hadn't been, molested or anything. So it all turned out well, and then I felt really kind of like, oh God, what a child you are. And so I can understand that sense of fear, but that was part of the divide of the 1960s.
Yeah, it's not an easy thing to make that choice to go to jail, because everybody has visions of what it's like to be in jail.
By the way, I noticed this picture, which we chose as our
I stole it off your publicity.
Basic image, and some of you know that Bob Fitch, the photographer who took that photograph, was King's personal photographer for the last 3 years of his life. Bob Fitch passed away a couple of years ago. He lived in near Santa Cruz, and but all of his images, thousands of them, of King, have been purchased by Stanford. They're freely available. If you want to use this image for any nonprofit educational use, any of the other thousands of images, and not just King, he also photographs Cesar Chavez and people like that. So,
where can people access that? Is it through your website?
Just go to you can go through our website, but the more direct way is the Bob Fitch Archive at Stanford. The Bob Fitch Archive at Stanford.
F-I-T-C-H.
Yeah, F-I-T-C-H. And he was very clear about that he wanted his images to be made available to the world, and which in our world is, I'm always dealing with copyright issues and all these restrictions on, and so it's so wonderful to have an image like this.
I'm glad to learn about that, because I run into that too, designing graphics.
The interesting thing also about this image is that I met the granddaughter of the painter who did the Gandhi image, and it was given to King during his trip. He stayed in India in 1959 with Coretta and spent time going through the country, meeting with a number of Gandhians, and so one of them gave him this this portrait, which he took back and put in his office. And so I met the granddaughter of the artist. Another thing about that is that it's I have this. I went to the place, one of the places where King's visited in Mumbai, and there was a woman there who had signed King into the museum, and in this place where Gandhi had his office in Mumbai. So King had written his signature, and Coretta had written the signature. And that evening, he decided that he did not want to go back to the hotel. He wanted to stay in the room where Gandhi had, and he spent the night there. And so the woman who signed me in had also signed in Martin Luther King. So I had the privilege of meeting, this is one of the two people I've ever met who knew both Gandhi and Martin Luther King. And the other one I just met more recently, and he's still alive and at one of the Gandhi ashrams, and actually where Gandhi's ashes are now, and Warda. And he had, the reason why he knew Gandhi is that as a teenager, he had told his father that he wanted to drop out of school and work with Gandhi. And his father had agreed to this and just said, yeah, I guess you can learn a lot by just, probably more than you can learn in high school. So he agreed to let him go and work with Gandhi. So he did, and he was part of some of Gandhi's last marches. But he is still very much an active Gandhian. And so when King came in 1959, he met Martin Luther King. So those are the two people I know who knew both Gandhi and King.
It was, you just mentioned 1959 is when
Yes.
King went, and he was there for several weeks, and
Most of them a month, yeah.
yeah, and Gandhi, of course, was no longer
And
with
if you
us.
want to know more about that trip, you can go into our website, but you can also go to Google Arts and Culture. And there's an exhibit of materials from King's trip to India in 1959, which we prepared.
At Stanford?
No, this is just on the web. If you just go to Google Arts and Culture and look under the Martin Luther King exhibits, and that's one of them.
Let's talk about the conference.
Yes.
October 11th through 13th.
Yes.
So not too long, less than 2 weeks now.
Yeah, it's kind of the culmination of something that started about a dozen years ago.
Is that right?
When Prasad Galanopoulos, a long-time Gandhian, still lives in India, but he walked into my office and said he wanted to meet me, and we started talking. And he had been a professional who had resigned his position to devote full time to carrying out Gandhi's ideas. And so that has been his life. And so we started talking about our common ideas, and he said, Clay, it'd be really great if there's so many Gandhian organizations in India, so many people inspired by King's legacy in the United States. What if we could build a global network starting with those two groups of people? And I said, well, how do you do that? I have no idea. And he said, yeah, look, you know a lot of the people. You know the King family. You know all the, you travel a lot and know all these people who do the King holiday, and I'm kind of in the same position in India, coming together with. So we could do this, and that to make this long story short, we did a class together at Stanford on Gandhi and King in 1958 in the spring, and then I proposed an overseas seminar, and Stanford agreed to fund an overseas seminar. I took 15 students to India in 2008 to study Gandhi. Went to a number of places, talked to a lot of the people. I did this with Linda Hess, was then on the Stanford faculty, and as a result of that, then I realized that we were coming on 1959, and wouldn't it be nice to have something to mark the 50th anniversary of King's trip to India? And since part of my trip, not sponsored by Stanford, was sponsored by the State Department as a cultural exchange. So I talked at a number of Indian universities and then told the State Department, well, look, we need to do something official in the United States. And it led to a congressional delegation. John Lewis, Andrew Young, Harris Wofford, just all these people who had been associated with King and the movement. Some of them had connections, like Harris Wofford had been to India many times. He was a former senator from Pennsylvania. He was also one of the inspirations for the Peace Corps under John Kennedy. So all these people came in 1959, and we went to, again, a number of different places. And so that became the beginning of, I really expanded my horizons a great deal because I got to meet a lot of Indians when they would come over here. They would stop by the King Institute, and my relationship with Prasad developed. And so that's how this conference really.
Interesting.
So last spring in March, Prasad said, look, let's have a conference. We've got the 150th anniversary of Gandhi coming up.
Good time to do it.
Good time to do it. And so I called a meeting at Stanford, and I got a number of people from all over the country to come and pledge, let's do a conference, a major conference. And I must admit that I was a little bit, it's one of those things where I know what it costs to run a conference.
Yes.
And I knew it would be, upwards of $100,000. It's actually going to end up more than that.
Oh.
And at the time, I didn't have a cent of that. One thing I do know is I know a lot of people I can call on the phone, and we've pulled together the funding, and a lot of it has come from Indian Americans who want to see this happen, and but from a lot of other people also, I hope that all of you come, and some of you at least pay the fee. To come. It's $100. The banquet is another $100. We are hoping that I'll at least break even. If not, I might be fired from my job because I've got to pay the bills. But I think I am certain now that we are going to at least break even, and it's going to be fun.
And what can people expect there?
Well, the first night, one of the first persons I called was Ela Gandhi, who I'd met once about 10 years ago, and she's the granddaughter of Gandhi, but she's a South African. She was very much involved in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. So she has a whole independent, I don't think she's ever lived in India, really. But she's a wonderful person. I called her because I thought it's kind of key to have somebody, an offspring of Gandhi. And I said, can I get you to come to Stanford? And she said, yeah, I'm really interested in this idea. And I said, can I want to pay your way and all this kind of stuff. And I thought, gosh, what is a first-class ticket from South Africa going to cost me? And I said, I don't fly first class. A coach ticket is fine. And, it was just the easiest. For me, as a person who was often asking people to come and talk, if every person I called was that easy, and she was just wonderful, and she, just give, whatever accommodation you can arrange, it's fine. And so she was that type of person. And then Rajamohan Gandhi, who is a historian, I'd met him before. I've met a number of people in the Gandhi family, and he's written a wonderful biography of Gandhi, probably one of the best that's out there right now. Very, very honest about Gandhi's flaws, and doesn't paper over that at all. And he's going to be here. Martin Luther King was someone who I went to India with in 1959, in 2009 to mark the 50th anniversary of his father's trip, so I got to know him, both as president of the King Center, but also especially during that trip, and get to know his family and his wife, Andrea. And then the offspring of Dolores Huerta. I was hoping to get Dolores Huerta. She unfortunately had committed to another event in Fresno, and so she suggested her grandson. I think it's a grandson. I always mix up the one who is Cesar Chavez's granddaughter, and one of them is her grandson. But they'll be here. So that'll be the first night. And we'll have some wonderful people who I've done work with over the years. I've done a play called Passages of Martin Luther King, which I've taken to China and taken to India. And so many of the people who have performed no, not to India, to the West Bank, who have performed in Passages of Martin Luther King are going to be there. There'll be some surprises of people who will be there. As I mentioned, James Lawson, Mary King, who is just a person who has spent her life either in the movement in the South, but also studying Gandhi. She's written about Gandhi and King. Going through, take the rest of the evening
the speakers list here runs to 2.5 pages.
Yes, and as I said, there will be more people who we can't even fit into the program, but they will be there and be available and be part of the discussion. I've told the moderators, look, sometimes there are going to be people in your audience who will know more than the people on your panel. So you have to get through the panel and open it up to the audience, because I guarantee you there'll be people who will have a lot to say.
All right. So are there going to be workshops? You mentioned a very important workshop earlier.
Well, by the way, on Sunday there'll be a special event. Come to Stanford Church. It'll be an ecumenical service featuring Sister Helen Prejean. Some of you know her as a leading anti-death penalty advocate. She has also visited the King Institute in the past, and just a wonderful person. Another person who, yeah, I'm on a book tour, but where'd you say, when do I have to be there?
Yeah.
So it's been a pleasure to kind of get that kind of response from so many people who will try to be there. Some of you might be surprised. I went to George Shultz just recently. He will be there. There's so many people that you might be surprised. You mentioned King, Gandhi. They have special meaning, and it's wonderful. I think that Stanford should be honored to have such a distinguished group on its campus, and go there even before the conference, because we have put banners. We have put. Any of you have been there so far? I think you have. Yeah. Large Michael Colopy, a photographer whose project is Architects of Peace, all the living winners of the Nobel Peace Prize, big things. We'll have Matt Herron, who photographed the Selma to Montgomery March, and there'll be a long picture of that, and on the opposite wall, the Salt March. Large
Good
banner
comparison.
picture.
Yeah.
Large pictures of King and Gandhi. I'm going to be impressed, and I'm helping to put it up. So and it's still going up, and we're working with Mario Chiodo, a wonderful sculptor, to actually bring some of his sculpted pieces and we're trying to figure out how to fit them through the doors of Tresidder Union. It's going to be, because he says, don't break my sculpture. And so we're going to have to work on that and try to do that on Friday. And so there's just so many wonderful things that are a part of this, and it's just amazing to me how many people have come forward and say, look, what can I do to help?
And do you feel like you're really laying the basis to finally start this international network?
Yes, and that's another aspect of it. We're here in Silicon Valley, and some of you know that the communications revolution that happened here, back in the 90s, I would read all these manifestos about how wonderful this was going to be. It was going to bring the world together, bring world peace, and all that kind of stuff. Now we know that it brought the world together to sell all the information to people to make them billionaires. But that promise is still there. Technology is neutral. That the notion that I can every Friday have a video conference and have people in different countries in different parts of the United States just talking to each other for free. I mean, no, we don't have to worry about the cost. You know, that is extraordinary. Yes. And the notion that Facebook has 2 billion people who participate in it, it's extraordinary. And what we need to do is use our influence. Don't fight it. It doesn't. It's kind of like the abolitionist movement saying we're gonna fight modern transportation and communication, and publications. You know, they use the technology of their day to the limit. The movement of the 60s had the Watts line, you know, all these kinds of things which we thought was high tech, and it really was just a reduced rate for long distance. And you know, so all of these movements are going to use the technology of their day. And also, I think if we mobilize ourselves, we can leverage that power to go to Facebook, to go to Apple, to say, look, yes, we'll use your technology, but there's a deal to be made. That education should be freely available. Personal information should be never saleable. And if you make develop the notion that you can use this as a way of providing global information to people, but also assuring them that no one's going to sell their personal information. And all of that is part of human rights. I mean, one of the most basic human rights is the right to have privacy about your personal beliefs.
The right to your own thoughts.
The right to your own thoughts. And that is almost the most basic of all human rights. And what we need to do is, and we should have that ethos. I mean, you know, I wouldn't, if I had your personal telephone number and someone came up to me and said, would you give it to me? The first thing I would do is ask your permission before doing that. Yes. So why does someone feel that it's okay to ever do that to anybody, to make money from their personal information? We need, part of changing the world is creating that kind of an ethos where that is just not acceptable, and anyone who makes money doing that, you know, I'll just end on this because it bothers me, because I started out as a computer programmer before I was a historian. I went to.
I'm glad you changed careers.
I went to I was just waiting for the room to be available. So there was a really large class in CEMEX Auditorium on the Stanford campus, one of the largest auditoriums. 500, 600 people could sit in there. CEMEX Auditorium in the business school. So I walk in, and it's a class on computer science. That's why it had 600 people in it. You know, and what was the first lecture of the first class? It was on data mining. And the basic thrust of the class was there's lots of data out there. If you can learn how to use it and sell it, you can make a fortune. So that's what young people are being taught. That's their way to a quick fortune.
And it's perfectly okay.
And it's perfectly okay. It's like any other kind of mining, except that it's mining in the personal information of lots and lots of people. And so we need to obviously challenge that kind of an ethos where that is deemed legal. And not only that, we kind of admire it for people who are very successful at it. So that's part of it, is to make it possible for global information, knowledge that we need to have, to flow downward to people who need that information. Education should be free. Next 2 weeks from now, I'm going to be at a conference. Education is a human right. But personal information as a human possession that belongs to the person, and that our entire ethos has to be around that, our entire legal system has to be based around that, or else we're not going to get anywhere. And that's going to take some changes, and it's going to change the economy of Silicon Valley. Anyway, that's my rant.
It's all based on advertising and selling us. We're the product in many ways.
Yes, it's the class made clear, that is the most valuable thing in the world, information.
We have maybe 5 minutes left here. I want to just explore a little about what else you hope to explore at this conference, and I just want to read a couple of lines from your conference materials, because this brings it up to date. You're talking about modern communications. Obviously, this is not just a history conference.
Yeah.
This is
this last session will be, where do we go from here? How do we stay
That's
connected?
exactly what I wanted to ask you, because that's the name. That was the name. Wasn't that Dr. King's last book?
Well, where do we go from here?
Where do we go from here? Right?
And I think we'll always be asking that question: what have we learned, and what can we? How can we move beyond that? I think that one of the things about human rights is, and I'm teaching a course on it actually every Wednesday, if any of you want to sit in on it. It's from civil rights to human rights. But one of the ironies of human rights is that it's often taught as, here was this idea that was kind of invented in Europe during the Enlightenment in Europe, and it kind of crystallized in France and United States with the Declaration of Independence and the Declaration of the Rights of Citizens, man and citizen in France, and the French Revolution, the American Revolution. And so I, at the beginning of my class, I was just saying, what's wrong with this picture? And one of the things that's wrong with it is it leaves out Haiti. That Haiti came out of the same intellectual climate. It was a revolution based around the concept of human rights, ending slavery. They actually did it, and have been punished ever since by France and the United States, who repeatedly invaded Haiti and actually forced Haiti, in order to gain recognition from the world, to compensate the former slaveholders. And of course, Haiti had no financial ability to do that. That debt was not paid off until the 1940s. And so we're talking about how to make human rights viable in the 21st century. And we've relied on the nation state to do that. When you think about that is so impossible. I mean, you think of the irony of the United States: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What is the only entity that can take away your life, deny you your liberty, and restrict your pursuit of happiness, other than the nation? That's the only entity that has the legitimate right to take away your life. And so we're relying on that to protect our human rights. We have to have an alternative to that, and the only alternative is us. That just as you had a couple of hundred wealthy white guys get into a room in Philadelphia and say, we declare a nation. And they had no power to do that. They were just doing it, just declaring it. And 200 years later, that was the most powerful nation on the face of the earth. So why can't we do that? Why can't we create a virtual nation that's just not dedicated around protecting borders, about building armies, about doing all the bad things that nations get to do? And it seems like that's the challenge of the 21st century, is to try to find some alternative ways of protecting human rights, of doing the things that nations like France and the United States set out to do 200 some years ago.
And to
but,
take the
but
initiative.
failed miserable in doing it.
And to take the initiative ourselves.
And take the initiative ourselves and to build into...
To go back to where we started, and we're almost out of time, to
Yes.
grab that baton and go on forward with it. My guest has been Dr. Clay Carson, Executive Director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute at Stanford University. The Gandhi-King Global Initiative Conference kicks off October 11th through the 13th. Check it out. Register at kinginstitute.stanford.edu. And we'll
Just
see.
remember the acronym GKGI.
GKGI. You can search on that. That's how I get to it all the time. Dr. Carson, thank you so much for joining us on Other Voices. Thank you all for joining us here.